History House, and on behalf of the Royal Australian Historical Society, I say welcome. I'm Christine Yates, the President of the Royal Australian Historical Society, and I'm very pleased to welcome everyone here to this rather extraordinary event, I think. I will begin by acknowledging the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we meet, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to elders past and present. And I want to say thanks very much to Peter Hobbins for organising this event. It is a great opportunity to learn about an event, a tragic event in our history, and it is a tragic event in world history that occurred in the aftermath of the First World War. As we know, the war to end all wars. Unfortunately, in many ways, the war itself overshadowed the catastrophe, really, of the flu pandemic. And I was speaking to one of the participants earlier on, and no, we don't call it the Spanish flu anymore, and we're going to hear today why not, that's for sure. But at the end of the events, we hope to be able to inspire all of you to look to your own history and your own community's history to explore the impact, because it is going to be different in each area. The impact is going to be experienced differently, and oftentimes, and I've been watching on Facebook, as one does, people starting to share stories of their family experiences, and it's those experiences too that we hope to inspire you to do more about and go home and look through some of those family photos and get a bit of an idea of another aspect of both our local history, our community history, and of course our own personal history. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Peter Hobbins, who is going to provide an introductory overview, and then we'll get the session going. So thank you very much.
Full house. Thank you everyone for coming along today, and I'd love to thank Christine for introducing us, my fellow historians who are going to be presenting later on. But mostly today is about you. We really want to encourage you to take away some of the information and suggestions we give you during the next hour and a half in order to go away and research your own family history, your own local history, your own history of your profession, whether it be nursing, medicine, public health, etc. And we'd love you to bring back those stories to us. So in fact, today is part of a larger initiative that we're coordinating here at the Royal Australian Historical Society, which we're calling An Intimate Pandemic. We're trying to encourage you to share with us any research you've done on the impact of the flu on our society a century ago. Now, I'm used to giving hour-long talks about the history of Spanish flu or pneumonic influenza, and I've got to do that in 3 minutes here because I'm just giving you a very brief background before we get into the more interesting presenters. To me as a medical historian, this is what the flu is all about. This characteristic syndrome called heliotrope cyanosis, this awful bluish face that characterised those people who were on the verge of death from pneumonic influenza or Spanish flu 100 years ago. But actually for most people who came down with this disease in 1918 or 1919, most people experienced it just like a bad cold or a normal bout of flu. It was only the more extreme cases that went on to that deadly phase. So I want to emphasise that it did have a high mortality, it did kill a lot of people, it was highly infectious, it infected about a quarter of the world's population over the space of 2 years, killed 50 to 100 million people, which is 3 to 6 times the number of people who died through all of World War I. But for a lot of people who contracted pneumonic influenza, the symptoms were similar to the sort of seasonal influenza we pick up each winter. But if you got into trouble, then things started going significantly wrong, particularly for those severe cases. And what tended to happen was the victims' lungs would fill up with fluid. It was like a form of pneumonia, hence the name pneumonic influenza. And it could take people weeks or even months to recuperate from this if they didn't die. Now the mortality rate, the proportion of people who came down with the flu who actually died varied enormously. Here in New South Wales, about 0.5 or 0.5% of the population died of Spanish flu through 1919. In Samoa, which was under New Zealand control at the end of the First World War, 24% of the entire population died in the space of just a few months. So it gives you some sense of just how dramatic not only the death rate is, but imagine that impact on a society as well. And that impact lasted for decades afterwards. The entire traditional structure of that society was affected by the flu. Luckily in Australia we were somewhere on the other end of that. Why was it called Spanish flu? I'm glad you asked. I use the phrase a lot simply because it's a shorthand that we all understand. It didn't come from Spain. In fact, if we look at the timeline, there's still a lot of contention amongst contemporary medical scientists as well as historians about where this disease broke out. I tend to favour the people who suggest it came up on the Western Front, probably in France, in very late 1917, early 1918. But there's another school of thought that says that it came out of the massive American training camps at the start of 1918 as well. A less credible, I think, suggestion is that perhaps it originated in China and came to Europe through the large numbers of Chinese labourers who moved there. They all have some credence, but there's no definitive proof. What we do know is it didn't come from Spain. The reason it's called the Spanish flu is that it killed the King of Spain in April 1918, and Spain was a neutral country through the First World War. They didn't have censorship on their newspapers, so the stories started coming out through those. And if you go and look at the Australian newspapers, there's a date in about mid-June 1918 where bang, Spanish influenza is a thing. There'd already been talk about a pneumonic influenza going around, but Spanish influenza was the name that hits us in June 1918, and it stuck. Here in Australia, we were lucky. The worst phase of the disease came in the middle of 1918. The initial phase, the first half of 1918, was highly infectious. It spread very easily between people, but it wasn't particularly fatal. But by the middle of the year, about June, it had developed into a much more deadly strain. And as I mentioned, the rates could vary from 2 to 24% death across an entire population. That was the form that was spreading around Europe and then went back to the United States, went down to Africa, made it to the bottom of Africa and to India through the final months of World War I. But of course, it was really only in those final months that they realised the war was actually coming to an end as well. So just as the flu was at its deadliest peak, both highly infectious and really deadly, that's when ships bringing it to the country arrived off Australia's quarantine stations, particularly at North Head, just out near Manly, and also in Darwin, but then Melbourne, Fremantle, Adelaide and so on. So there was this huge armada of ships bringing people back from the war from October 1918 really through to December 1919. 180,000 people came back to Australia in that 1 year. We'd not seen anything like that since the gold rushes of the 1850s. But the important thing was our quarantine system held. We kept pneumonic influenza in quarantine from October through to January 1919. And by then, the version that came ashore somewhere in Victoria, probably around Melbourne, was a much milder disease. It was still highly infectious, but it wasn't nearly as deadly. So Australia had one of the lowest death rates of Spanish influenza, which is not to say it's trivial. And I like to point out that through the course of World War I, about 62,000 Australians died, mostly in the Australian Imperial Force. That's about 15,000 per year over 4 years of war. The following year, 1919, another 15,000 Australians died of pneumonic influenza. So in fact, the casualty rate here in Australia was almost identical to that across 4 years of warfare. The difference was that it was on the home front, and a large proportion of those casualties were women as well as men. By the time the disease reached Tasmania, which was one of the last places in the world infected in any large way by pneumonic influenza, hardly anybody died. It had become much less virulent by that stage as well. Now, I could go on, so I'm going to actually shut up now. But we've been calling this project an intimate pandemic, which is, of course, a sort of cognitive dissonance going on there. How can it be a pandemic, a disease that affects almost the entire world and yet be intimate? And I like to use this example from the North Head Quarantine Station Cemetery. It's a New Zealander, a male aged 30, a perfect mid-range pneumonic influenza victim who were mostly men. They were mostly adults aged 20 to 40 years old. And he died on Armistice Day 1918 at the quarantine station. Now, he didn't bring the disease into Sydney, he was held in quarantine, but William Campbell Menzies died there. And his grave is in a lonely cemetery that was in an official compound. And it's one of 15,000 in Australia over that year. But when you look at that's his headstone, when you look at his footstone, you can see dated. So for somebody, for William Campbell Menzies' son, daughter, that was the intimate impact of this pandemic as well. And it's these stories that come down to individual families, to local communities, as well as the wider impact on our society, that we want to encourage you to think about and possibly go away and research after today. So that's why we've been coordinating this project. You'll hear a little bit more about it at the end of the session today, but in the meantime, I'm now going to hand over to our first presenter, Leila Elmas. Thank you.